Welcome back to my garage workshop. It's exactly 1 week since the last GX UK round, and since a load of you have been asking, what I'm going to do in this episode is show you my maintenance regime in between races and how I think you should prep a kart like this so it's ready to go for your next race. Now in GX UK, we've got the O plate coming up in 2 weeks time, and that means this thing needs to be tip top and ready to go because I'm going to have absolutely no time to do any of that when we get to the track early on Saturday morning. So here are the things we're going to cover. Basic cleaning. We're going to strip this thing down and we're going to clean off any dirt we can see. Now to make this easier, part of our post-race day strip down procedure is to actually clean the kart anyway. So this should be in relatively good nick as it stands. But what I need to do, and what I wouldn't have done at the track, is take the wheels off, clean any dirt out behind there, take the bodywork off, clean behind those sections, clean the chain in detail, re-lube all the bearings, all that kind of thing. But in addition to that, we're going to be changing oil in the engines. I'm lucky enough to have a practice engine and a race engine. Both of those need fresh oil before the next event, so I'm going to show you how we do that. And I need to strip and fit a brand new set of tyres because at the O plate we finally no longer have to use these old ones that have been on the kart since the start of the season. So let's crack on with that right now, starting with stripping the bodywork and the wheels off the kart. So as we go through this process, I'm going to do my best to show you which tools we're using. This is just a T-bar socket, so that's what we use for the wheels. Let's start with that. Something else we do after each race to make life easier is we will clean the chain and we'll attach the chain to the sprocket. So we're going to keep the same one on unless we're changing chains after several rounds. They last at least half a season, probably a whole season. So to stop it dragging on the floor when we're transporting the karts, we actually cable tie it to the sprocket just like this. And if we've got time, we'll clean it beforehand too. Whilst doing each of these steps, cleaning, taking things apart, you'll quite often find something that you missed at the track or something that was broken which you didn't know about. I'm hoping not to find any of those things today, but I'll obviously let you know if I do. Now, one thing that happened to me at the last race, and you'll have seen it in the last video, is I bent my axle by clipping a barrier.
Fiddlesticks.
And that meant that I had a very hasty repair to do at the circuit. I certainly didn't take the time to do it quite as meticulously as I would have done back here in the workshop. So checking over all the axle components, making sure all the grub screws are in exactly right is something else we're going to be doing during this maintenance. Okay, so now the wheels are off. What we're going to do next is take off the hubs and then the bodywork. So we'll take the rears off, the fronts off, clean underneath them, make sure the bearings and the stub axles are nice and clean. We'll get this bodywork off too, just to make sure there's nothing cracked under there that we didn't spot. So for the rear hubs, it's a 6mm Allen key, and I just found that my nicest one isn't in the box. So it's something I'm going to need to order before the next race. Now, because we clean these so often, mine come off really, really nice and smoothly. And you'll see that to really help with accuracy in measuring our rear width, I keep these spacers inside. Now, you might hear people say that this stops the axle from flexing, and therefore having a spacer is like extending the axle. There's obviously truth to that, but the tyres that we use aren't really grippy enough for that to be too much of an issue. So I'm quite happy having that accuracy, keeping my spacers, and that's how much I have in the rear of mine. Puts me out to about 1395mm in terms of rear width. And as you can see, all pretty clean, but I'm going to just sand that down with some fine sandpaper anyway, just to make sure it's absolutely perfect. Now, since it started to spit with rain at the end of the last race, see we've got a little bit of rust that's on the brake disc here. There's nothing to worry about, that'll disappear the moment we start braking, but I am going to sand that off slightly anyway. You can also see here, even though this axle was brand new, we've got some rust spots forming, purely because there was a little bit of rain when we were packing up leaving the track. Absolutely nothing to worry about, but I'm still going to sort it out, make sure it looks nice and clean and shiny. So for that, I go in my drawer of sandpaper here. We've got all of our drawers labelled. Sandpaper and wire wool tends to come in handy quite a lot. I'm using what looks like 500 grit, seems to work fine, just abrasive enough to take off what I need to. And we simply do this. In the middle of the axle too. Now you might ask, why do we care how shiny the axle is? Why don't we just leave it? But it's for times like I experienced at the last race where you need to quickly remove it that it's really important. You want it to all be nice and smooth so you don't run into snags when you're trying to get it out in an emergency. And as with all these things, it helps you find problems that you might not have seen if it was covered in dirt and rust. And it's going to just clean it with this GT85, nice clean microfiber towel, of which we have loads as part of our equipment, and then we'll move on to the front hubs. I'm obviously being careful not to get any of this on the brake disc or brake pads. So nice shiny clean axle. There's a lot more to happen back here soon though. Right, let's move on to the front. So for this, we need a 23mm socket. This gets the nut out of the hub here. We're going to take that out first of all. All of these components I'm taking off go in the seat. That's always the best place to store them. You know where to look for them afterwards. So what have we got here? We've got a spacer that's come off the front hub, slightly dirty, but that'll clean up easily. And we obviously have the front hubs. Again, they're pretty clean because we clean these in between races. And you'll notice so far, I've not even put any gloves on. My hands are still pretty clean. In a moment though, when we get to slightly more dirty stuff, I will put on the gloves, especially when we come to the engine. So I'm just cleaning off the spacers one by one. I'm gonna clean inside the hub here before we re-lubricate it with some bearing lube. They can then go back on. And this is the bearing lube we use. The lid fell off, so we've taped it back on and there's still loads left, but it's just ceramic Kart bearing lube. You probably recognize it from the picture there. A little squirt of that on anything that we need to slide past. Anything else tends to work really well. So a little squirt into this bearing here and into the other side of that bearing in here, and then this bearing this side, and then the other side of that bearing too, if we can get to it. There we go. So that should all slide nicely once we pop it back on. Anyone who's fitted these before knows the little collar inside needs to be just held in place with your finger as you fit it, and it slides on nice and easily and should spin around nice and freely. Look at that, lovely. And then it's the two spacers after that. I'm obviously giving away my setup here. There's no secrets. It's just the standard OTK front end setup here in terms of track width. In terms of how tight to do that nut up on the end, you simply keep tightening it whilst trying to rotate this little spacer here, and when it can't turn anymore, you're slightly too tight with the nut, you back it off a fraction until you can turn this again, then you know you're right. That one's ready to go. I'm now just going to repeat that on the other side, and then we'll move on to some more interesting stuff. Okay, that front end section's pretty much done, and you might be asking, are we not going to entirely take off the stub axles and clean that? Now that is something you could do, but since I've done that very recently and this isn't a full strip and rebuild, I really don't see any reason to do that. Aside from just checking how tight the bolt is and re-lubing the bearings, I'm quite happy and I can see that everything inside here is nice and clean. That is optional though. If you want to take that off and completely clean inside there, you can. For me on this one, on a standard prep between races, that's not something I'd worry too much about. So next up then, let's just pop this bodywork off, make sure it's all clean under there. Now on my car, all this involves is pulling back these rubber sleeves. These are from JB Kart Racing, by the way. You see it's stamped with JKR. That's JB Kart Racing on eBay. Search for JB Kart Racing on Google, and then you simply pop out the little plastic collar, same on the rear, and then my bodywork will come straight off. And you might have noticed I've actually already tried to clean off most of the rubber marks from these side pods. These only have to last one more round anyway with this side sticker. So I'm relatively happy with how clean that is. I'll just give the ends of these a little bit of a clean up since there's some rust building up. Make sure the insides of the tubes are clean, and that's pretty much done. It's also a good opportunity just to clean the chassis itself, and you can get behind it nice and easily. Again, being careful not to get any lubricant kind of spray or anything like WD-40 or GT85 on the brake disc. I can also see my bearings on the rear here have a little bit of dirt, so although we're going to re-lube them, and I'm obviously not using this as bearing lube, I'm just going to try and get in the gaps here whilst I'm down on the floor. Make sure all of this is totally pristine and clean. Okay, I'm happy with this side. I'm going to spin the cart around, do the other side of the bodywork, but as suspected, I'm not really finding any problems, just making sure it's clean. Now, if you're really switched on, you might notice that the rear of my right-hand side pod actually has to be attached with a bolt, and it might also look like the bolt's the wrong way up. Normally you'd go bolt from the top to the bottom and put the nut on the bottom. The reason is you actually can't get to it with the engine on it. It gets completely covered up by the engine if you do it the other way around. And the reason I can't just use the little plastic things like I've got on the other side of the cart is the chassis has a slightly different shape here, which doesn't really allow the rubber thing to slide over it. So just a small compromise, and I hold it on with a bolt, albeit loosely, as we run all the bodywork very loose. All I'm doing now is just sanding off a little bit of rust that's built up on the end of these pod bars so they all slide in properly. Okay, and lastly, with these side pods, I don't know whether you can really see it, but they're just slightly dirty on the inside, and they're not brand new. I didn't fit brand new plastics to this cart because they're really expensive, and this is a low-cost series, especially since I spent money on stickers. So what we're going to do instead is clean off all of the dirt on the inside of these with PVC cleaner and see if we can make them look a little bit more new. Works pretty well, smells quite strong. This stuff is for cleaning PVC windows, you know, plastic conservatory windows. It might not come across on the camera, but there is a significant difference there, so Happy with that. So there we go. They're ready to go back on, but there's not really any point until we finish doing the rest of the cart because they'll just be in the way. So let's keep them aside and let's move on to the rear end. Make sure that axle's fitted properly. Now, you might remember I said at the start that when I fitted this axle, it was in a rush at the track, and that meant I didn't use any Loctite when I put the grub screws in. So what we're going to do now is remove the grub screws, clean them in detail, and the holes they're going into, then Loctite them and refit them, and then wrap them in tape. Pretty standard process when you're refitting an axle, but it's something I just didn't get a chance to do at the track. Grub screw Allen key is this one. I actually don't know what size it is, and for this point onwards, I am going to be wearing gloves to get a little bit dirty and greasy. We like to use these. These rubber gloves are called Extreme Grip. They're from Amazon. They've got like a textured surface to them, but they're also quite thick, so you don't have to constantly change them and they're not constantly tearing. I've got a picture of a gorilla on them, if that helps. So we'll take these grub screws out one by one, clean them, put them back in with Loctite, and then we'll look at removing the sprocket because this is not going to be the right sprocket for the next track. So here we go. We've got the grub screw out, we get a cloth, and you literally turn it like this inside the cloth. You're going to see just how much dirt comes off this. Remember, this was a brand new grub screw when it went in at the last race. And this dirt, which is really grease, might mean it can wind itself out of the hole and release the axle and allow the axle to slide side to side, and we don't want that. So we're going to clean each of these and then we'll put them back in. Before they go back in, we're going to use some brake cleaner in those holes to make sure there's no grease left in there that we're going to screw them into. This is obviously one of the dirtiest parts of the car because this is where the chain is. Lots of chain lube gets thrown around here. And even when you try to keep it clean, this area tends to end up dirty. Okay, next up, Loctite. I'm using this blue stuff here, it's called Perma-Lock. The tiniest amount on each one is all you need. And don't over tighten these when you put them in because you can easily strip the thread. I put them in that way up and then I switched the Allen key around to give it one final tweak, and that's it. We are going to come back to this and wrap those grub screws with some electrical tape. But we can't do that until the thread lock has dried around the outside there because we don't want to get any liquid on the tape. So we'll go and do the other side first and we'll come back and finish off. Okay, next up, some electrical tape. So for this, we're using color-coded purple electrical tape to match the cart, and what I'm going to do is wrap that over the top of the grub screws. It just holds them down and discourages them from working loose, although that's not a perfect solution and they do sometimes still work themselves loose. This is extremely hard to demonstrate whilst doing it one-handed, so I'm going to attempt to put the camera on the cart. When that's done, it looks something a little bit like that, and it just means that the grub screws are held nicely in place. Right, next up, we're going to want to take off this chain, give it a bit of a clean, and probably remove the sprocket too. So we've got our nice 77 tooth sprocket to replace the 79 we took off from the last race. It's clean, it's shiny, it's ready to go. And you'll notice it has this thin cut at this point just here. Now this is how we're going to get it onto the axle. You see this sprocket can bend apart, so we're going to bend it over the axle because we run an inboarded rear sprocket. Now people are often worried about how to do this. I'm balancing the camera to try and show you. But all you do is you lean the sprocket like this, you push down, you can see how it bends, and you just slot it around the axle. Let's see if I can do this without dropping the camera. Here we go. Well, I didn't manage to do it without dropping the camera. I just about caught it, but you see how easily it goes on. Just requires some pressure on the top and it bends straight over, and that saves you all the hassle of having to take an axle out to change a sprocket. I'm going to now clean this side of the sprocket carrier, which I couldn't get to at the track. We'll give the chain another quick clean, and then we're ready to fit this all back together. Pop the rear hubs back on, pop the bodywork back on, give the bodywork a clean, and then move on to the engines. Last thing to do really back here is just to give this chain one more clean. It was cleaned as we left the last race, but I'm going to do it again just to make sure. All I do is spray it with some GT85 and then run it through a microfiber towel. It's going to be re-lubricated before it goes back out on track, but this is just to make sure there's no grit and dirt sitting in the links that I don't know about. Okay, we can now pop this back on the sprocket and we're going to cable tie it up like it was when we found it. We're also going to cable tie the throttle cable out of the way, because it's just another thing I don't want getting caught and bent when we're transporting the cart. So it's going to just stick up here on my seat stay. Okay, it's time for hubs to go back on, then the bodywork, then just a bit of a general clean and polish, and then we'll move on to engines and tyres. So we'll make sure we don't forget to put our spacer back in the hubs. And obviously they slide on nicely because we've cleaned everything and made it nice and smooth. We'll tighten that up and move on to the left. Lovely. Right, the brake disc has some rust on it, so I'm just going to sand that off quickly, mainly for aesthetics, because I don't like the look of it. In reality, all the rust would just come off the first time I hit the brakes, but let's just make it look nice. I think that'll probably do. One thing we haven't done though is really clean the whole brake caliper with some brake cleaner. So let's just do that, and then the rear end is basically finished. Cool, bodywork on, let's do it. If you're wondering why this part of the bumper has this kind of black wrap around it, it's purely because we load our carts onto the van upright and I don't want to scratch the number plate on the back. Okay, the next part is obviously the easiest element of this entire thing because it's just really polishing the bodywork. So with some Mr. Sheen and a clean cloth, I'm just going to spray all the stickers, give them a clean, just generally dust the cart and make the exterior look pretty. And then we're going to move it out of the way and get down on the floor and start doing some dirty work with engines. Just so I don't forget to mention it, obviously I am going to now just quickly re-lube the rear bearings. And one other thing that we do for cosmetics is we use this high performance tyre gel on the black plastic rear bumper to keep it looking all nice and shiny and black. So let's finish those bits, they're nice and simple, before we do the less enjoyable section of this. Now I'm just putting away all my tools that I don't think I'm going to need for the next section because I always like to know where things are. Underneath the camera here is a massive set of tool chests and it helps so much that they're organised properly. It makes every single step of this prep way easier. So as far as I'm concerned, the cart itself is now prepped, but we've got some oil to change in both of the engines and we have to fit a set of tyres to a set of rims. So that's what we're going to be doing next. But first I need a cup of tea because it is blooming freezing out here in this garage. Right, it's oil change time for my two engines, Paul Mullin and Super Paul Mullin. This one also needs its mounts putting back on. So we lent them to someone at the last race. So we're going to do that as well. I'll show you how that works for anyone who hasn't had to fit mounts to one of these Honda engines before. Right, what stuff do we need for an oil change? Well, we're going to need oil, and what I'm using here is Petronas 020, so it's a very, very thin oil, but that's what's been recommended to me by my engine builder. We're also going to need somewhere to put the old oil, and for that I'm using this fuel can here, and I've marked it mixed. That's something that I was mixing two-stroke fuel in, so that's already had oil in it in the past, so that's fine. We're also going to need this. Now, this isn't essential, but it's something that we use in this little workshop. I got it from Amazon, and it's a really good way of getting oil quickly into the engine without having to pour it and wait for ages for it to come out of a jug. But we will tip the last little bit in from the jug. So there's a faint black mark at 450 ml on there. That's how much oil we're going to put in. First of all, we need to drain each of these engines. So we'll do that first, and then we can get the fresh oil in. Simple as that. We have magnetic sump plugs on these engines. That means any little bits of metal that are floating around in the oil will be caught on the end here, hopefully. Although we change the oil so regularly, it looks pretty blooming clean to me. And I imagine when I pour this out, because it's only done one round, it's going to be quite clean anyway. But let's have a look. So we always tip it out of this front hole. You can ignore the little black one around the back, and ideally the engine would be warm for this, but obviously we don't have that option because it is a cold winter's day. And the oil's coming out with a slight dark tinge, but nothing dramatic. Definitely not coming out as quickly as it does when you do this at the track and everything's hot. Make sure you always tip the engine forward and never backwards to avoid oil going in the carburetor, so that's another good tip for anyone who's not used to these Honda engines. Let's see if we can get some more out of this. Okay, so now we've got the oil out of both of those. We can put the old oil aside, clean up the floor, and then we're going to put in some fresh oil. So here we go, 450 ml in there. So we have our oil in the jug. We're now going to suck that up with our little machine here. I've used this little fuel cap plug at the end here. You can get that from JB Kart Racing as well. Really, really useful so you don't have to put bolts in the end of fuel pipes and get them dirty. So we now suck this up. Pop the end of the tube in the engine and in it goes. And then we'll just pour the rest of the oil from here in. And I've actually cut a little slot out of this jug so it can be tipped all the way upwards. It's quite tricky to do this otherwise. One engine done. Just pop the sump plug back in. Make sure that's tight. We can set Super Paul Mullin aside. and that's an oil change on 2 engines. But one more thing we need to do on this one, and that's add a couple of mounts. So let's show you what I mean with that. On these carts, you need to offset the engine by quite a long way. And essentially that means away from the seat stays, otherwise the chain will rub. So we use these mounts. These ones are from 7 Kart. They're low, they're really nicely made, and they give you a very big offset away from the seat. So I'm gonna mount these, and there's a way to do it. And the easiest way is if you have a little table. Something a bit like this. And the reason is you need to be able to have the front of the engine hanging over the edge of a ledge like this, because you don't want to tip the engine backwards. As I said earlier, you'll get oil in the carb. So we're gonna take this one here. It doesn't really matter, they're both exactly the same, but I've marked this one as front, and so we literally just pop this in the bottom like this, making sure you put it the correct way around. Another reason I wrote front on it. And then we'll take these 13mm nuts, pop them on finger tight, and then we'll bolt this up nice and tight. Every time I lose this Allen key, I manage to find him again. He is eternal. Okay, front mounts are tight, and now we move on to the rear, and this time you can tip the engine over. You do it like this. And I can already see there's some dirt on here that I haven't cleaned off, so let me grab some brake cleaner. We'll give the side of this a little bit of a clean. And now to fit the rear, it's exactly the same. It's just much easier to get to because the engine's tipped forward like this. Okay, so there we go. Finished these 2 engines. It's time to fit some nice fresh tyres. So first of all, we have to remove the old tyres from the rims. So I'll show you how to do that. Here we have our practice tyres, which were used for an entire season, and they've done pretty well though. They've still got some tread remaining, but they're nowhere near as nice as a fresh set. And obviously you can see the difference. So let's get these off the rims. And what we have to do first of all is remove the bead retainers. So we've got these in these wheels, they're green bead retainers. We'll pop them off, deflate the tyre, and then we're going to use this tool to pop the tyre off the rim. We just unscrew the bead retainers by hand. It'll come out quite easily because they only went in recently. Then we pop the tyre on this little machine here. Set it to the right height first of all, the rear tyre. So we slide the tyre in. We're just trying to use the bead breaker now to break the bead, obviously, and there we go. Popped off. I have to do it on the other side as well. I'm going to show you this whole process with one tyre, and then I'll just repeat the steps for all the others. So now the bead's broken, this thing can get out of the way, and we're going to use these. These are our tyre tongs. Absolutely crucial, in my opinion, if you need to be swapping tyres around. So here's how you do it. You turn the tyre over so the rear is facing upwards. You put this circular piece in the top like this. You then find a gap, so you push the tyre sidewall down, and you hook these tongs in, and it helps if you push the other side of the tyre down so it's in the well. Obviously the wheel itself dips in the middle, and in order to have space to pull this down, you need to push this side down, and you see how easily this is going to just fold over like this. We then get this little pin that goes straight through the hole in the middle like that, and then to take them off, simply open the tongs like this. That's one side off. Next, you need to take the central thing back out, flip it over, pop the tongs in again, pop the tongs in like this, and then in one movement, you just push down on the wheel and push down on the tongs, just like this. And out comes the wheel. That's one out, but we need to fit a new one. So let's show you fitting it to this one here. So let's choose this one. This tyre is the chosen one, and this is going to be our right rear. And I know this because there are some directional arrows on the tyre here. We need to get this wheel inside this tyre. So to do that, I'm going to use some GT85. I'm first of all just going to spray around the tyre so this slides in easily. And the first thing you have to do is with a twisting motion, push down on the top, and it should pop in. Here we go. Okay, so we're half in. Now this is quite standard. It gets stuck at this point, especially when it's a cold day like this. I am now going to do something that was shown to me at a racetrack and seems to always work, which is kick this with my foot, and it should pop straight down in. Let's see, and I'm wearing foam kind of gardening shoe thing, so proper shoes, this is even easier. Here we go. Straight in. We're now halfway in. We then flip the wheel over, take the big plastic block again, that goes in the back part. It always goes in the rear of the wheel, not in the front side. And then we take our tongs, and this time we're using these little hooks. And what we do is you hook those over the side of the wheel inside the tyre here. And we're going to do a bit of a push down from the top as well. So we hook them in. The pin goes in the top again. I'm going to put some GT85 around here just to help the process. We then just open the tongs. As you can hear, the sticker that's on the outside is peeling away. That's just a piece of plastic sticker, you can ignore that. Then it's pin out, tongs off, plastic circle out, And there we have a tyre fitted to a rim, but it's not properly fitted yet. Next we need to inflate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these bead retainers back in, but not so they poke out. We don't want to stop the tyre from being able to pop onto the rim. So we're just going to screw them in enough that they're not letting air out. And then finally, we'll inflate the tyre. For this, I'm going to use my compressor over here. I've got this nice heavy duty compressor over there. My granddad got me. It normally takes about 90 PSI to get these fully on the bead. So let's see what we can do. I'm going to use loads of lube. I use this GT85. That seems to really help, but other people use tyre paste. Let's give it a go. That one did take exactly 90 PSI. We've got this side on the bead. I'm now going to do up the bead retainers just to stop them letting out any air, and then we'll get it popped on the other side of the rim. And as you can see, still not popped on the rear of this wheel. So we'll spray some GT85 and give it a few more PSI. There we go. Finally, at 100 PSI, we're popped on the bead. So we're going to release that pressure. And then we'll pump it back up slightly. And there we go, a rim fitted to a tyre. We've got a few more of those to go, but you don't need to watch that. You've seen how it's done. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope it's been useful showing you what we do to maintain these karts between races. If you have liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next video at the O plate, where I'm going to try and retain my GX UK O plate title. Thanks for watching, love you, bye.